Now, in other news, for this week's edition of Moral Dilemmas, we will discuss the moral questions raised by current events. Russia continues to wage its war of aggression against Ukraine. Many observers are asking how and whether Russia can be prevented from taking such actions again in the future, such as potentially destroying their military capabilities. But others argue that this is a step too far, potentially igniting something far, far worse potentially in the future. Well, I'm joined in the studio, and I'm delighted to be joined actually by James Woudhuysen, visiting professor of London South Bank University, to discuss this issue. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I mean, the first question I want to ask you is, what do you make of those who suggest that we should be going far, far further than just sending weapons to Ukraine, that actually what Russia has done has fundamentally changed the game in terms of, in ramping up escalation to such an extent where the West should consider whether or not they should take action to prevent Russia from doing anything like that again?
Well, Russia has changed the game, Inaya, that's indisputable. But I think when we look at the statements of Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary for Defense, that he wants Russia weakened so it can't quickly reproduce its forces, it's all very well, but it goes much further than the self-determination of Ukraine. That's what I'm here to defend, that it's a nation, it's got rights, the invasion was outrageous, and so on. That's one thing. To say that you're going to stop Russia from doing anything like this in the future indicates, to me, a great amount of bombast.
Well, but you know, if you look at some of the statements that have come out of the Kremlin recently, I mean, threats of nuclear escalation. I mean, we've also had Finland and other countries such as Sweden that previously were neutral, effectively in fear now to such an extent of perhaps future Russian aggression against their own state that they are now joining NATO, or at least wanting to join NATO. We've had this announcement today that that is the intention of Finland. So in that sense, can you really say that it's bombast in comparison to such strong statements and actions, actually, by the Russian regime?
We can't determine our policy by what Putin says or his representatives.
Well, their actions, I mean.
Yeah, but the point is that if you want to dismember Russia, you've first of all got to have the capability. Second of all, you've got to have the domestic support. Third of all, you've got to know how you would end it all. And right now, if you want to do that, at a moment when, as one of your correspondents just pointed out, when Keir Starmer doesn't know what a woman is, when Boris Johnson is very, very unpopular and has mishandled just about everything, including Ireland now, which is a very serious thing, Putin reads the papers. He knows about the failed withdrawal from Afghanistan that Biden conducted. And therefore, it is bombast to say, oh no, we're going to make sure that Russia never does this again. It fails to distinguish between the Kremlin, which is despicable, and the Russian people who may support the Kremlin at the moment. Yeah. But, if you want to prize them away from the Kremlin, then making such threats, as Austin did, is exactly the way not to do it.
No, but does that not assume that it's really Putin the problem? That actually only if you got rid of Putin, there was a kind of benevolent leader that the Russian people would just go along with them. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be, structural problems within Russia,
of course,
which seems to make figures like Putin more likely.
Of course, and it's very wrong to join in the general trend to personalise politics, whether it's about Boris or about Putin.
But isn't that then what the Western nations, therefore, are fearful of? That actually, even if Putin, when he was removed in some way or another, that actually he would then be replaced by potentially someone that has a stronger grievance?
Of course, that's true, but what we're failing to do is uphold Ukraine's right for self-determination. That's the struggle of the moment. Now, if you want to dismember Russia, you want to force it to pay reparations, you want to take all its minerals away, you want to reduce its armed forces and so on, well, go right ahead, if you can do it. I don't believe they can do it. And they might... Can I just finish? They might kind of factor in a little country called China and another one called India and all the support that Russia has. So, it's enormously grandiose. It neglects the fact that the West is in deep trouble itself. Let's wait till autumn. Let's have a look at the cost of living crisis. A war's going to be with Russia is just what the population wants.
But isn't that a different question, whether or not we have the capability to do it or whether or not we should from a moral perspective?
Well, one of the things about morality is you don't issue idle threats. right? You don't say, you know, we're going to make sure that Russia can never do this again. Well, how long is forever, you know, right? They can't do that. I was just reading, it was very interesting, in a queer website, their defense of the US Air Force decision to relocate trans Air Force families away from transphobic states. In other words, if you're in, I don't know, Mississippi or Birmingham, Alabama, and you're working for the USAF and you're trans, then the government there will allow you to move somewhere else. Now, is that the kind of pressure that Putin respects? Is it the kind of pressure that America can bring to bear with its US Air Force? Is it able to do things? I don't believe it is.
But then on that question, in terms of missing, is Ukrainian sovereignty missing from the conversation? But I guess the counter-argument to that is that in order to defend the principle of sovereignty more broadly, that we cannot necessarily coexist with a regime that is willing to violate it so grotesquely and provocatively in the way that Russia has. So that in that sense, this is actually, some people might argue, a way to defend sovereignty as a principle, to make sure that regimes that are hostile to it know that they cannot go around doing what they're doing.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that the West is that interested in Ukrainian sovereignty. You know, it's promised NATO and EU membership for years, never delivered it, doors always been shut. If anything, it seems like it would quite like to prolong the war and everything.
But what makes you say that there are some that want to prolong the war?
Well, because, you know, it doesn't know whether it's coming or going. You know, it would like to wear down the Russian forces, and you know, it completely exaggerates just how defeated Putin is. I hate Putin, and I hate the whole oligarchy. That's one thing. To imagine that, you know, everything's going swimmingly, as more and more defence correspondents and experts say, is quite wrong. It's very dangerous, the situation.
But isn't it Russia, Putin's regime, that has fundamentally been the one that has escalated this to such a huge extent?
Yes, that's one thing. But to cripple Russia, as the question
but is that not a consequence of their grotesque and unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression?
Well, you know, you've got to make sure that Ukraine comes out of this on top, and that Ukraine wins, right? If you want to embark on a whole, you know, in a different period, Operation Barbarossa without Adolf, but with China and India in the whole thing. And you believe you can get away with that with Biden and Boris and Macron.
But isn't it bigger than them? Isn't it bigger than them? Isn't it preventing this for future generations or future leaders?
Yeah, but when you're issuing a threat, they're the people in charge right now. Boris might go tomorrow. Biden might die tomorrow. But that doesn't prevent the fact that it's totally immoral and irresponsible to kind of hint at a march on Moscow or to, you know, provoke Putin further. I want him completely expelled from Ukraine. That's one thing. If Finland and Sweden want to join NATO, that's fine with me. That's their right. That's what self-determination means. But, you know, if you want a Eurasian war, which is where Austin is headed, I can't be on that bus.
Final question. So what do we do then? Do we continue to send weapons into Ukraine, and we don't know how long this war will continue? Do we need a kind of Marshall Plan type effort, to which some people are talking about, in order to rebuild Ukraine, in order to send that kind of message? And then there are others that are saying that we need to operate in the context of political realism and actually concede some of Russia's demands in terms of demanding Ukrainian neutrality, or asking of them to maintain that position, and potentially even sacrificing some regions in the east. I mean, what do you think?
No, I wouldn't do that. You know, Ukraine must determine what its needs are. It is not for us, and ministers say this, but they don't do it. It is not for us to determine, oh, well, look, you know, lose Crimea, have half of the Donbass.
But we could say,
neutral.
well, we're not going to allow you to join NATO and the EU. We could theoretically say that.
Yeah, but it's their decision. It's not our decision. You know, this imperial mentality is not confined to Putin, right? We've got it big time. And our whole attitude to Ukraine has been thoroughly patronising. So we can talk about reparations and so on, or a Marshall Plan. Do we have the money for a Marshall Plan? Did we learn anything from the Treaty of Versailles in the First World War? It's very different. But before you rush to acquire all the stuff that Putin and his clique have stolen from the Russian people, what about the Russian people in this? Isn't it their money? Or is it Putin's money now and therefore we'll take it? It's their money. He stole it. Therefore we need a broader and a longer view of the situation and not just to issue vulgar media threats in the manner of the US Defence Secretary.
Well, thank you so much, James Woudhuysen, visiting professor at London South Bank University. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts